The morning mist clung to the dense Virginia undergrowth like the breath of ghosts. And perhaps it was. Lieutenant Colonel James Morrison of the 5th Corps stepped carefully through the tangled maze of second-growth timber, his boots crunching on the carpet of dead leaves that had accumulated over decades of neglect. It was May 5, 1864, and the Army of the Potomac was about to enter what veterans would later call the most nightmarish battlefield in American history. The wilderness stretched before them like a living entity 70 square. Miles of impenetrable scrub oak, pine, and thorny underbrush that had reclaimed abandoned farmland. Trees grew so thick that sunlight barely penetrated to the forest floor, creating a perpetual twilight that seemed to swallow sound and hope alike. This was no place for civilized warfare, no ground for the grand maneuvers that generals dreamed of in their academy studies. General Ulysses Grant, newly appointed as General-in-Chief of all Union armies, had planned to march his 120,000 men quickly through this green labyrinth. His strategy was simple: avoid battle in the wilderness at all costs, emerge into open country beyond, and force Robert Lee's Army of Northern Virginia to fight on favorable ground. What Grant hadn't counted on was Lee's intimate knowledge of this terrain and his willingness to turn the landscape itself into a weapon. As Morrison's regiment pushed deeper into the undergrowth, the very air seemed to thicken with foreboding. Branches caught at their uniforms, roots twisted beneath their feet, and the oppressive canopy above blocked out not just light, but hope itself. The men moved in single file along narrow paths that had once been logging roads, their formation stretched thin and vulnerable. Communication between units became nearly impossible as the forest swallowed voices and reduced visibility to mere yards. According to battlefield accounts documented in the National Archives, the dense vegetation created a unique form of psychological warfare that neither army had experienced before. Veterans of Gettysburg and Antietam found themselves in an alien environment, where traditional military tactics became useless, where cavalry was blind, and where artillery could barely find targets through the green maze. Colonel Morrison paused at a small clearing, one of the few breaks in the endless canopy, and consulted his compass. His orders were to maintain contact with the units on his flanks, but he hadn't seen another blue uniform in over an hour. The silence was unnatural. No bird songs, no rustling of small animals, just the heavy breathing of his men and the occasional snap of a twig underfoot. Even the insects seemed to have abandoned this place. Behind them, stretching back through the narrow trails, came the remainder of Grant's massive army, the 2nd Corps under Winfield Hancock, the 6th Corps under John Sedgwick and Governor Warren's 5th Corps, to which Morrison belonged. They were seasoned fighters, these men, survivors of 3 years of brutal warfare, but nothing had prepared them for what awaited in the wilderness. As the morning progressed, reports began filtering back from the forward scouts. Confederate forces had been spotted moving through the undergrowth, not retreating as Grant had hoped, but advancing with purpose. Lee was not running from this fight. He was embracing it, choosing to make his stand in the one place where numbers meant nothing and chaos reigned supreme. The trap was closing, though few realized it yet. In the suffocating embrace of the wilderness, 64,000 Confederate soldiers were about to collide with twice their number in Union forces, and the forest itself would become the most terrible participant in the battle that was about to unfold. General Robert Edward Lee stood motionless atop a small rise, one of the few vantage points in the endless sea of green that surrounded his Army of Northern Virginia. At 57, the Confederate commander carried himself with the dignified bearing that had made him a legend. But those who knew him well could see the weight of 3 years of war etched into the lines around his gray eyes. This morning of May 5, 1864, he was about to attempt perhaps the most audacious gamble of his military career. Lee's aide-de-camp, Colonel Charles Marshall, approached through the underbrush with the latest intelligence reports. The news confirmed what Lee had hoped. Grant's massive army was strung out along the narrow roads that cut through the wilderness, their formations disrupted by the terrain, their superior numbers rendered meaningless by the impenetrable forest. It was exactly the opportunity Lee had been waiting for since learning of Grant's appointment as General-in-Chief. General Grant believes he can march through the wilderness without a fight, Lee remarked to his staff, his voice carrying the soft cadence of his Virginia upbringing. He underestimates both this ground and our familiarity with it. Lee had fought in these woods before, during the Battle of Chancellorsville just over a year earlier, where he and Stonewall Jackson had destroyed Joseph Hooker's army using these same tangled thickets as their ally. The Confederate commander's plan was deceptively simple yet incredibly dangerous. Instead of allowing Grant to emerge into open country where Union superiority in men and artillery would prove decisive, Lee would strike while the Federal forces were still trapped in the undergrowth. His two corps, commanders Richard Ewell and Ambrose Hill, would advance along parallel roads and engage the enemy piecemeal, preventing Grant from deploying his full strength. Lieutenant General Richard Stoddard Ewell, commanding the Second Corps, received his orders with characteristic nervousness. The one-legged veteran, who had lost his limb at Second Manassas, understood the risks they were taking. In the wilderness, armies could become lost within yards of each other. Friendly fire incidents were inevitable, and coordinated attacks became nearly impossible. But you'll also recognize the strategic brilliance of Lee's decision to fight here, rather than in open ground. According to Civil War historian Bruce Catton's account in A Stillness at Appomattox, Lee's decision to engage Grant in the wilderness represented a fundamental shift in Confederate strategy, from defensive warfare to aggressive offense. Despite being outnumbered nearly 2-1, Hill's Third Corps was already in motion, their gray and butternut uniforms blending perfectly with the shadows of the forest. These were veteran soldiers, many of whom had been with Lee since the 7 days battles around Richmond. They moved through the undergrowth with the practiced ease of men who had learned to fight in whatever terrain God and their commanders provided. Their confidence in Lee bordered on the mystical. They called him Marse Robert and would follow him into hell itself if he asked. As the morning progressed, the first tentative contacts began between Confederate skirmishers and Union advance guards. Musket fire crackled through the forest, muzzle flashes creating brief illumination in the perpetual twilight beneath the canopy. But these were just the opening notes of what would become a symphony of destruction. Lee positioned himself where he could maintain communication with both corps commanders, though he knew that once the battle began in earnest, control would become largely impossible. In the wilderness, battles fought themselves, with individual regiments and companies making their own decisions as they encountered friend or foe in the Green Maze. Colonels would command armies, and sergeants would determine the fate of thousands. The irony was not lost on Lee that he was about to fight the Battle of the Wilderness against an opponent who shared his preference for aggressive action. Grant had earned his reputation in the Western theater through relentless offensive campaigns, and unlike previous Union commanders who had faced Lee in Virginia, this one would not retreat after the first setback. The question was whether Lee could inflict enough damage in these woods to change Grant's mind about continuing south toward Richmond. As the sun climbed higher, barely visible through the dense canopy, the sounds of battle began to intensify. What had started as scattered skirmishing was evolving into something much larger and more terrible. The Battle of the Wilderness was about to begin in earnest, and neither army would ever be the same. The first full volley of musketry erupted at 10:30 in the morning, and Private Thomas McKenna of the 146th New York knew immediately that this would be unlike any battle he had ever experienced. The muzzle flashes created a deadly constellation of light in the forest gloom, while the smoke from hundreds of rifles created an impenetrable fog that mixed with the natural haze of the wilderness. Within minutes, McKenna could barely see his own hands, let alone the enemy he was supposed to be fighting. The battle lines, so carefully drawn on maps back at headquarters, disintegrated almost immediately. Regiments became separated from their brigades, companies lost contact with their parent units, and individual soldiers found themselves fighting alone against enemies they could hear but not see. The forest itself seemed to conspire against both armies, turning what should have been organized warfare into a series of deadly skirmishes between small groups of terrified men. "Deploy as skirmishers," Morrison shouted, though his voice barely carried 20 yards through the thick air. The traditional battle lines that had dominated warfare for centuries were useless here. Instead, his soldiers spread out among the trees, each man essentially fighting his own private war while trying to maintain some semblance of unit cohesion. The Confederate attack came from 3 directions simultaneously, a testament to how completely the forest had disrupted both armies' sense of direction. Ewell's corps, advancing along the Orange Turnpike, collided with Warren's 5th Corps in a meeting engagement that neither commander had fully planned. What followed was chaos in its purest form. Sergeant Michael O'Brien of the 83rd Pennsylvania found himself face to face with a Confederate soldier at a distance of less than 10 feet. Both men fired simultaneously, their muskets' muzzle flashes briefly illuminating their faces in the gloom. O'Brien's opponent fell, but before the Union sergeant could reload, 2 more gray figures emerged from behind a massive oak tree. The hand-to-hand fighting that followed was savage and personal, a far cry from the distant, impersonal slaughter of more conventional battlefields. As documented in the official records of the War of the Rebellion, the Battle of the Wilderness marked the first time in the Civil War that large-scale combat occurred in terrain so dense that traditional command and control became virtually impossible, creating what military historians would later term soldiers' battle conditions. The undergrowth that made movement so difficult also made the wounded's plight even more terrible. Men struck down by bullets or bayonets found themselves unable to crawl to safety. Through the tangled vegetation, their cries for help went unanswered, not from lack of compassion, but because their comrades literally could not find them in the maze of trees and thorns. Medical corpsmen, usually able to move freely between the lines during lulls in fighting, found themselves trapped and lost, wandering in circles while carrying their useless stretchers. Artillery, the great killer of Civil War battlefields, proved nearly useless in the wilderness. Cannon crews found that they could not see their targets, could not effectively range their guns, and could not move their pieces through the undergrowth. When they did manage to fire, their shells often struck trees and exploded harmlessly in the canopy, raining splinters down on friend and foe alike, but causing little real damage to either side. The psychological effect of fighting in such conditions was devastating. Veterans who had stood firm under artillery bombardments at Fredericksburg and Chancellorsville found themselves unnerved by the invisible nature of the wilderness fighting. The human mind, it seemed, could better cope with visible death than with the constant threat of unseen enemies lurking behind every tree and thicket. By noon, both armies were locked in a struggle that neither could properly control or understand. Regiments fired into other regiments of their own army, mistaking blue uniforms for gray in the perpetual twilight. The confusion was so complete that some units found themselves surrounded without realizing it, continuing to fight in multiple directions until their ammunition ran out or their officers were killed. The Battle of the Wilderness had become exactly what Lee had hoped it would be, a fight where superior numbers meant nothing, where tactics became irrelevant, and where the outcome would be determined by the courage and endurance of individual soldiers rather than the skill of their generals. But even Lee had not anticipated just how terrible such a battle would become. By early afternoon of May 5th, the Battle of the Wilderness had devolved into something that resembled medieval warfare more than the organized conflicts that had characterized most Civil War engagements. Captain William Hayes of the 2nd Wisconsin led what remained of his company through a nightmare landscape where wounded men hung impaled on thorn bushes, their cries for help creating a chorus of agony that seemed to rise from the very earth itself. The undergrowth had become so thick with smoke that breathing itself was a struggle. The acrid smell of gunpowder mixed with the organic scent of disturbed earth and the metallic odor of spilled blood. Hayes estimated that visibility had been reduced to less than 20 yards. In most places, and in some of the densest thickets, he could barely see his own outstretched hand. Fighting under such conditions required a different kind of courage than standing in ordered ranks on an open field. Lieutenant Samuel Foster of the 5th Alabama crouched behind a fallen log, trying to reload his musket while Confederate and Union soldiers fought hand-to-hand less than 50 feet away. The sounds of battle in the wilderness were unlike anything he had experienced in 2 years of war. Instead of the organized volleys and artillery barrages of conventional battles. The forest echoed with isolated gunshots, the clash of bayonets, and the individual cries of men locked in mortal combat they could barely see. The wounded presented a problem that no army manual had addressed. In open country, stretcher bearers could move relatively freely during lulls in fighting, carrying injured men to field hospitals behind the lines. But in the wilderness, there were no real lines, no clear distinction between front and rear. Wounded soldiers crawled through the underbrush for hours, becoming hopelessly lost, while others bled to death within yards of help that could not reach them. Through the tangled vegetation, Colonel Morrison, now commanding what remained of 3 different regiments that had become intermingled during the fighting, realized that traditional military organization had completely broken down. Companies from New York regiments found themselves fighting alongside Pennsylvania units they had never seen before, while entire battalions had simply vanished into the green maze, their fate unknown to their commanding officers. The Confederate forces were experiencing similar difficulties. General Hill's corps, advancing along the plank road, had become so scattered that individual companies were fighting independently, often unaware of friendly units, operating less than 100 yards away. The famous coordination that had made Lee's army so effective in previous battles was impossible to maintain when officers could not see their own subordinates, let alone coordinate with adjacent units. According to battlefield reports preserved in the Virginia Historical Society, the density of the wilderness vegetation created acoustic conditions that further complicated command and control, with the sounds of battle becoming distorted and muffled, making it nearly impossible for officers to determine the location and intensity of fighting even in their immediate vicinity. The psychological toll of wilderness fighting began to manifest itself in ways that shocked even veteran soldiers. Men who had stood firm under the most intense artillery bombardments found themselves paralyzed by the claustrophobic conditions of forest combat. The inability to see more than a few yards in any direction created a sense of isolation and vulnerability that was far different from the shared danger of open field battles. Private McKenna, separated from his regiment during the morning fighting, had been wandering through the undergrowth for hours, following the sounds of gunfire that seemed to come from every direction. He had encountered other lost soldiers, both Union and Confederate, but the meetings were brief and usually violent. The normal protocols of warfare, the brief truces that allowed for the removal of wounded or the exchange of prisoners, were impossible to maintain when enemies literally stumbled into each other without warning. The ammunition supply, always critical in Civil War battles, became a nightmare in the wilderness. Supply wagons could not navigate the narrow, overgrown roads, and ammunition carriers often became lost while trying to reach their units. Soldiers began to run low on cartridges by mid-afternoon, forcing them to rely increasingly on bayonets and rifle butts in close combat. As the day wore on, a new and terrible element was about to be added to the battle of the wilderness. The dried leaves and dead wood that covered the forest floor, ignited by muzzle flashes and exploding shells, had begun to smolder in several places. Small wisps of smoke, barely visible against the already smoke-filled air, were beginning to appear among the trees. The forest itself was about to become a participant in the battle, and its contribution would be more terrible than anything either army had yet experienced. The stage was set for the most horrific aspect of the Battle of the Wilderness, the forest fires that would trap wounded soldiers in a blazing hell from which there would be no escape. The first flames appeared shortly after 2 o'clock in the afternoon, small tongues of orange light flickering among the dried leaves near the Orange Plank Road. Corporal Daniel Murphy of the 20th Maine noticed the smoke first, assuming it was merely another consequence of the intense musketry that had been raging for hours. But as he watched, the wisps of gray smoke began to thicken, and the acrid smell of burning vegetation added a new horror to the already nightmarish conditions of the wilderness battlefield. The forest fire started innocuously enough. Muzzle flashes from hundreds of rifles had been igniting small patches of dead leaves throughout the morning, but most had smoldered out on their own. However, the unusually dry conditions of early May, combined with decades of accumulated deadfall and the constant rain of sparks from musket fire created perfect conditions for a conflagration. What began as isolated smoldering patches soon merged into larger fires that began to spread with terrifying speed through the undergrowth. Lieutenant Colonel James Walker of the 13th Virginia watched in growing alarm as orange flames began to lick at the base of a massive oak tree less than 50 yards from his position. The fire moved differently than he had ever seen before, not in a straight line but in unpredictable patterns, following concentrations of dry material and dead wood. Within minutes, what had been isolated patches of flame had connected into a wall of fire that began advancing toward both Confederate and Union positions. The wounded were the first to suffer from this new torment. Men who had been shot or bayoneted and were unable to move found themselves directly in the path of the advancing flames. Their screams added a new dimension of horror to the battle, and soldiers from both armies began abandoning their positions to attempt desperate rescue missions. Private McKenna, still lost in the maze of trees, came upon a Union soldier whose leg had been shattered by a musket ball, crawling frantically through the underbrush as flames approached from behind. "Help me!" the wounded man cried, his voice barely audible above the crackling of burning vegetation. McKenna dropped his rifle and grabbed the soldier under his arms, dragging him through the thorny undergrowth. As the fire advanced, the heat was becoming intense, and the smoke was so thick that breathing required conscious effort. Around them, other soldiers, both Union and Confederate, were engaged in similar rescue attempts, the battle temporarily forgotten in the face of this new and impartial enemy. The fires created their own weather system within the forest. Superheated air rose from the flames, creating updrafts that spread burning embers far ahead of the main fire line. These firebrands landed on dry leaves and dead wood, starting new fires that quickly spread and merged with the original blaze. The wind patterns created by the fire also began to affect the movement of smoke from the musketry, creating swirling clouds that made visibility even worse than before. General Warren, commanding the 5th Corps, found his headquarters threatened by advancing flames and was forced to relocate twice during the afternoon. The fire had disrupted his communications with subordinate commanders, even more than the forest itself had managed to do. Courier riders found their usual routes blocked by walls of flame, and the telegraph lines that had been strung along some of the roads were quickly consumed by the fire. As documented in Shelby Foote's comprehensive The Civil War, a narrative, the forest fires at the Wilderness created unprecedented conditions in American military history, where natural forces became as deadly as enemy action, forcing soldiers to choose between facing bullets and facing flames. The Confederate forces experienced similar difficulties. General Ewell, attempting to coordinate his corps' advance, found that entire sections of his battle line had been forced to withdraw, not because of Union pressure, but because of the advancing fires. His aide-de-camp reported that at least 2 regiments had become completely separated from the rest of the corps while attempting to move around a particularly large fire. The psychological impact of fighting while surrounded by forest fires was devastating to both armies. Men who had shown incredible courage under enemy fire found themselves terrified by the prospect of being burned alive. The flames moved unpredictably, sometimes dying down only to flare up again minutes later, sometimes spreading rapidly through areas that had seemed safe moments before. By late afternoon, the fires had created a new geography within the Wilderness. Large sections of forest that had been passable in the morning were now impassable walls of flame. Units that had been separated by the thick vegetation now found themselves cut off by fire as well. The battle itself began to fragment into isolated engagements as the fires divided the battlefield into separate compartments. The most terrible aspect of the forest fires was the fate of the wounded who could not be reached or moved. Their cries for help continued long into the evening, growing weaker as the flames approached. Some soldiers, both Union and Confederate, chose to shoot wounded comrades rather than allow them to burn alive. Acts of mercy that would haunt the survivors for the rest of their lives. As night began to fall on May 5th, the Battle of the Wilderness had become something beyond the experience of warfare. It had become a fight for survival against an enemy that recognized no uniform, no flag, and no surrender. As darkness fell over the wilderness on the evening of May 5, 1864, the forest fires created an apocalyptic landscape that seemed torn from Dante's Inferno. Captain Hayes, leading the survivors of his Wisconsin company through what had once been a dense thicket, now found himself navigating between islands of flame that cast dancing shadows on the smoke-filled air. The normal progression from day to night had been replaced by an eerie twilight, illuminated by dozens of fires that continued to spread through the undergrowth. The sounds of battle had changed as well. The organized volleys of musketry that had characterized the afternoon fighting had been replaced by sporadic gunshots, as isolated groups of soldiers encountered each other in the maze of fire and smoke. But louder than the gunfire were the screams of wounded men trapped by the flames, their voices creating a chorus of agony that could be heard for miles through the forest. Sergeant O'Brien, separated from his Pennsylvania regiment since noon, stumbled through the burning woods with two other soldiers he had encountered during the retreat from the fires. One was a Confederate private from North Carolina, the other a Union corporal from Massachusetts. The three men had formed an unlikely alliance in the face of their common enemy, helping each other navigate through the hellish landscape where the distinction between friend and foe had become meaningless in the struggle for survival. The fire had created its own tactical situation that neither Grant nor Lee had anticipated or could control. Entire brigades found themselves cut off from their parent divisions, while regiments that had been fighting each other hours earlier now found themselves trapped together in shrinking pockets of unburned forest. In some cases, informal truces developed as Union and Confederate soldiers worked together to rescue wounded men. From the path of the flames, Colonel Morrison, now commanding a mixed force of soldiers from half a dozen different regiments, established a defensive position in a small clearing where a creek provided some protection from the fire. His command included men from New York, Pennsylvania, Ohio, and, remarkably, a squad of Confederate soldiers from Georgia who had become separated from their unit and had chosen cooperation over certain death in the flames. The logistics of warfare had completely broken down. Supply wagons could not navigate the burning roads, medical personnel could not reach the wounded, and communication between headquarters and field units had become impossible. Both armies were fighting not just each other, but the forest itself, which had become an active participant in the battle with its own deadly agenda. Lieutenant Foster of the 5th Alabama found himself in command of a company that included soldiers from 3 different Confederate regiments, all mixed together during the chaotic retreat from the fires. They had taken refuge in an abandoned cabin, one of the few structures in the wilderness, but even there they were not safe. Sparks from the surrounding fires had already ignited the cabin's roof twice, and the men had to take turns climbing up to beat out the flames, while others maintained watch for enemy soldiers who might emerge from the smoke-filled forest. According to the memoirs of Union General Governor Warren, preserved in the Library of Congress, the night of May 5th in the wilderness represented a descent into a hell that no military manual had prepared us for, where the very ground itself had become our enemy, and where the distinction between victor and vanquished became meaningless in the face of our common struggle against the flames. The wounded presented the most heartbreaking dilemma of the night. Men who might have survived their injuries under normal circumstances found themselves facing death by fire. Medical personnel, when they could be found, faced impossible choices about which wounded could be moved and which would have to be left behind. Some doctors and nurses stayed with patients who could not be evacuated, choosing to face the flames rather than abandon their charges. Private McKenna, exhausted from hours of fighting and fleeing, found himself in a group of about 20 soldiers from various units who had taken shelter in a rocky area where the fire could not easily spread. Among them were Union and Confederate soldiers, but the normal animosity had been replaced by a grim camaraderie born of shared suffering. They shared water, ammunition, and information about safe routes through the burning forest, their common humanity overriding their political differences. The fires continued to spread throughout the night, creating new obstacles and changing the battlefield's geography hour by hour. Roads that had been passable at sunset were blocked by walls of flame by midnight. Creek beds that had offered refuge filled with smoke and became death traps. The wilderness, which had already proven itself to be unlike any previous battlefield, was transforming itself into something even more terrible. As the night wore on, both armies began to realize that May 6th would bring not just a continuation of the battle, but a fight under conditions that no military commander had ever faced. The forest fires showed no sign of diminishing, and with the coming of daylight, the Battle of the Wilderness would enter its second day under circumstances that would test the limits of human endurance and courage. The sun rose on May 6, 1864, over a transformed battlefield that bore little resemblance to the dense forest that had existed just 24 hours earlier. Captain Hayes, who had somehow managed to maintain command of his mixed unit of survivors through the night, surveyed a landscape that looked like the aftermath of some biblical catastrophe. Blackened tree trunks stood like monuments to the dead, while wisps of smoke continued to rise from smoldering patches of ground that had once been thick undergrowth. The forest fires had fundamentally altered the tactical situation for both armies. Areas that had been impenetrable walls of vegetation were now open ground littered with fallen timber and ash. Conversely, some sections where the fire still burned remained completely impassable, creating new barriers that divided the battlefield into isolated compartments where small units fought their own private wars. General Grant, establishing his headquarters in a relatively clear area near the Lacey House, faced a situation unlike anything in his considerable military experience. His aide, Lieutenant Colonel Horace Porter, brought reports that painted a picture of an army that had been scattered and disorganized, not just by enemy action, but by the forest itself. Entire brigades were unaccounted for, supply lines had been severed by fire, and casualty reports were impossible to compile because so many units had become intermixed. During the night's chaos, the second day of fighting began not with organized attacks, but with scattered skirmishes as small groups of soldiers emerged from the smoke and ash to encounter their enemies at close range. The normal procedures of warfare, the deployment of skirmishers, the formation of battle lines, the coordination of artillery support had become largely irrelevant. In the post-apocalyptic landscape of the burned wilderness, Private McKenna, now part of a group that included soldiers from at least 6 different regiments, found himself advancing through an area where the fire had consumed everything combustible, leaving only bare earth and charred stumps. The silence was eerie after the crackling of flames that had dominated the night. Even their footsteps seemed muffled by the thick layer of ash that covered the ground. The casualties from the forest fires would never be accurately counted, but they were substantial. Men who had survived the bullets and bayonets of their enemies had perished in the flames. Their bodies burned beyond recognition. Others had died from smoke inhalation, and many more bore burns that would cripple them for life. The fire had been more impartial than any human enemy, consuming Union and Confederate soldiers with equal indifference. Lee, surveying the destruction from his command post, recognized that the wilderness had given him both victory and defeat simultaneously. Grant's army had been bloodied and disorganized, prevented from achieving the quick march through Virginia that the Union commander had planned. But Lee's own forces had suffered terribly as well, and the forest that had been his ally in stopping Grant had also consumed many of his own soldiers. Colonel Morrison, leading his improvised command through the ash-covered remnants of what had been a forest road, reflected on the transformation that had occurred not just in the landscape, but in the men who had survived the Battle of the Wilderness. They had faced something beyond conventional warfare, something that had tested not just their courage as soldiers, but their humanity as men. The arbitrary nature of the forest fires had shown them how thin the line was between life and death, between survival and destruction. As documented in the comprehensive battle reports compiled by the War Department and housed in the National Archives, the Battle of the Wilderness resulted in over 28,000 casualties between both armies, with an unknown additional number lost to the forest fires, making it one of the costliest battles of the Civil War in terms of human suffering. Relative to the time engaged, The battle officially ended on May 7th when Grant made the decision that would define the rest of the war. Instead of retreating as previous Union commanders had done after facing Lee, he ordered his army to continue south towards Spotsylvania Courthouse. The message was clear: the Army of the Potomac would not be deterred by the horrors of the wilderness, nor would it abandon its mission despite the terrible cost. But for the men who had fought in the burning forest, the battle of the wilderness never truly ended. In their dreams, they would return again and again to those smoke-filled woods where the screams of burning men echoed through the night, where friend and foe had become indistinguishable in the chaos of fire and smoke, and where they had discovered that war could become something even more terrible than they had ever imagined. The wilderness had claimed its victims not just in the thousands who died, but in the thousands who survived, carrying with them memories of a battle that had transcended the normal boundaries of human conflict and become something approaching the limits of what mortal men could endure. The forest fires had burned not just trees and undergrowth, but something essential in the souls of those who witnessed them, leaving scars that would never fully heal. As the armies moved on to continue their deadly dance through Virginia, the wilderness returned to silence, its trees slowly beginning to regrow over the graves of the men who had died there. But for those who survived, the Battle of the Wilderness would remain forever the standard by which all other horrors of war would be measured. The hellish fight that had left thousands lost, not just in battle, but in flames that had consumed everything, including innocence itself.